books that I remember reading. Maybe I should ask you. Did you read of Mice and Men when you were growing up?
I did, yes.
What about To Kill a Mockingbird?
Yes.
So To Kill a Mockingbird's on a very common list. How about the Harry Potter books?
I didn't read them, no.
Okay. Toni Morrison, The Bluest Eye, for sexual abuse.
Are there any Lerone Bennett's on that list?
Let's see. This is a list from the American Library Association. So these are a little bit different age groups from that standpoint, but I just was surprised to see of Mice and Men, Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah. Is that banned now?
It's been on the list. Kill a Mockingbird keeps coming up. And then there's a tremendous number of these books in the last 10 years that have homosexuality and LGBTQ connotations that have been part of the list. The Bluest Eye keeps showing up. Now, I can understand 50 Shades of Grey might be something you want to be careful about having in your library in the elementary school level, but it's just Kite Runner, Gossip Girl series. It's just interesting. To Kill a Mockingbird shows up almost every year over the past 15 years.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
So let's separate the university from public schools for just a minute.
Many universities are public schools.
Well, that's where I was going. Where I was going is that at the collegiate level, post-high school level, you have private universities and you have public universities, and you have some that are both. From a public university standpoint, when the government used to fund those universities more, and you've been a lifelong educator, much more so than I can say. With the state-funded universities, Mississippi State, NC State, did the state legislatures define the curriculum going back 20 years, 25, 30 years, or is this just becoming more and more commonplace?
That's a very interesting question. It's a very complicated question.
Okay.
There has always been influence by legislatures or attempted influence by legislatures and governor's offices and political offices and PTAs, et cetera, on what is taught. And there's always been governmental influence through school boards. Okay. So let's accept that as a base. Right. It is the school boards that determine what books they're going to buy.
Right.
And in that manner, there has always been influence on content.
Right.
And I'm fine with that because openly, objectively, the school boards are supposed to represent the community.
Right.
Right. Now, we can get into whether they do or not, but that is the ideal.
Right.
And there have also been periods in our history where there has been an exaggerated influence by governmental entities. And it's never been on I shouldn't say never, but it's rarely been on a national basis. It's usually on a state by state or community by community basis. So you can always point out, I think throughout history, there has always been somewhere, someplace in the United States, I'm sure we could have found somebody who decided, I don't like this, I'm going to make a change, and I'm in a position to do that. And so I'm going to inappropriately put my finger on the scale. We know historically that there have been groups that have influenced the selection of textbooks based a lot like what's going on now with critical race theory. So this isn't new. This is not a new strategy, but the utilization of that strategy waxes and wanes with the intensity of the discussion and the success of politicians to make certain issues important. In my childhood history book, had maybe 2 to 3 pages on the Civil War.
What war?
And the war was about states' rights. Period. That's all it said. And the slaves were freed. And Abraham Lincoln was a hero. Now, there was no discussion about the complication of Abraham Lincoln's personality and the growth and evolution he had to go through. There was no discussion about the financial dependency that the Southern aristocracy had on slavery. There was no real discussion on anything, you know. And one might ask, do you really expect a 13-year-old to be able to understand that when they take history, right? But I have to tell you, when I got into this again in college, I was angry at what I hadn't learned in high school.
So what I want to know, though, is for the private schools, the universities that are not state subsidized, and the private elementary schools and or high schools, does anybody censor outside of the academic leadership? I mean, are they influenced by legislatures because they're a private entity? How
It all
much
depends. So first of all, the answer to your question is likely not.
Okay, that's
But-
where I was going.
But when I say likely not, it's probably because they don't have to.
Right.
Because the push is coming from the people who are sending their children to private schools.
Right.
So the private schools are probably already, excuse my phrase, whitewashed the curriculum.
I don't understand the term.
I
I think
bet.
it goes back to Tom Sawyer.
You think?
Yeah.
But you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You know, there's no need. And right now, nobody wants to pay attention to private schools because they are partly supported by public money that nobody wants to recognize.
So a private school, though, can define how liberal or how conservative it wants to be or whatever topic it wants because it's not as dependent upon external funding, except the external funding of student tuition.
Private schools are more responsive to the parents
Right.
because that's where most of the funding comes from.
Right.
However, society benefits from a good public education
Right.
system, right? Now, so it's not as if the private schools get to do what they want. They just, they get to do what their parents want.
Right.
And the people who tend to send their kids to private schools tend to have a more conservative view. But once again, this isn't about liberal versus conservative views. This is about gaslighting an issue.
Right.
And then dictating how that issue is going to be addressed in a public school system.
So the banning of books, which has been going on forever in
Yes.
some way, shape, or form.
Southern schools ban certain books. The reason I only had 3 pages in my history book is because the history book that had a chapter on it wasn't bought.
Well, what we've gotten to is the banning of books is equally based upon characters of color.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same strategy. The same in the 60s, they picked books that treated the South with respect. They picked books that depicted the Civil War as having no winner, essentially. And even if the South lost, it lost with dignity. They picked books that promoted an equitable view on the South's position and the North's position and Confederate heroes and Union heroes. They picked books so that the South could survive politically and so that they could continue its heritage through its children without its children being embarrassed because they weren't the victors. It picked books that were more likely to present General Sherman as a terrorist when he burned his way through Atlanta than might look at the Jefferson Davis as a traitor to the United States. The point was there was a strategy behind it.
Well,
Okay.
there's a new strategy though.
Yes. Now the new strategy is we got to make sure we don't buy books that promote wokeness. We got to make sure that we don't put books in our children's hands that has the acronym CRT in any way. We got to put books in there that don't spend more than a page on George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or police training. You see my point.
I want to add to your point though. I happen to be on a website. 50% of the books that were banned in the last 2 years they've included characters of color or title with issues of race and racism.
Yeah.
50% though were LGBTQ and sexual themes. So we're now starting to see two issues that have become the primary topics for restriction.
Yes. Yes. And it amazes me, actually infuriates me to find that people are willing to they become so animated by one issue, just I guess same way I'm doing, that they're willing to deprioritize things that are fundamentally dangerous.
Well, I mean, listen, this whole discussion of banning of books and freedom of speech is a political discussion as well.
I know. That's why I brought it up.
Yeah, I mean, it's as much as we said we would try to talk more about veterinary medicine and a little bit about less about politics, we kind of got off on this. But to me, again, it's just we've had these discussions for my generation. It's become more and more political. The gaps that we've talked about for the past 2 years have become wider and wider, and all of these issues are so polarizing that we can't come up with a common way of working through these things. It goes back again to politics and the gap that the political system has created to being you're either on one side or the other, and there is no in between.
So let me pull you back a bit. This is nothing new. We have not become hyperpolarized any more than the originators of the Constitution.
Okay.
They were as polarized as we are.
Yes.
Okay. They may have been as inept in the discussion as we are, right? Except that they pulled together a pretty good Constitution.
Pretty good.
I think. However, we have to relearn and we have to practice how we get past these polarizing points. My dismay, my discouragement is how focused we can get on one item, on one issue, and how we use human psychology. I believe that we tend to prioritize certain issues differently. I do believe facts are facts. I just don't believe that they all add up the same way in your mind as they do mine. And that even when I add them up in mine, I go back and look at them again and say, well, wait a minute. I think this is a much more important factor than that is. And I'm willing to compromise that to get this. In our public discourse, we melt everything down to one issue. Do you believe in critical race theory or don't you? Does it cause harm or doesn't it? Does it truly describe how we got here or does it not? Are you embarrassed by it or are you or aren't you? We don't want to talk about any of those things. All we want to say is it good or is it bad? Which side are you on? I don't want to know why. I just want to know, is it good or bad? You got to pick.
Yeah, and you're only given two choices.
And you're only given two choices. That is the problem with our discussions.
Yeah.
Right?
That's correct.
Because otherwise, we would allow the discussion to occur and just say, I think this is bull. This is not how we do it. We get here. And I am not going to participate in the discussion because it makes me feel uncomfortable, or you have unjustly blamed my gender and race. On the other hand, I may not have a defense, and therefore I now feel guilty and I don't know what to do about it. And so I'm gonna say it's bad. And I don't want my son to have to go through the same disequilibrium that I went through trying to figure out why you think that I didn't do this to you. When we were talking about affirmative action the other time,
Yes.
the other day, I came up with another analogy I just have to explain. I was listening to Fed Board saying that we were going to have to raise interest rates again. And they asked them, you're sitting here saying you're going to drive inflation down to 2%. And in the process, you're going to put people out of work. How do you explain that to the people that are going to lose jobs? And his response was, if we don't control inflation, more people will lose jobs. This will be painful, but this is the least painful path we have to take. That's what affirmative action was about. There's no doubt that some white people didn't get a job when there was only one job to be had and it went to a Black person. But if you don't correct the problem now, it's only going to get worse. And fewer people lost jobs because of affirmative action than would have lost livelihoods had there been a sea change of riots to force fair consideration.
Interesting. When you go back and look at freedom of speech issues, going back to the political side of things, going back to Martin Luther King and the freedom of speech, and you even look at some of the books that have been the most challenged by different groups, they're books that are mainstream.
Yeah.
And books that I remember reading. Maybe I should ask you, did you read Of Mice and Men when you were growing up?
I did, yes.
What about To Kill a Mockingbird?
Yes.
So To Kill a Mockingbird's on a very common list. How about the Harry Potter books?
I didn't read them, no.
Okay. Because they're considered satanic.
See? Yeah, I understand.
Toni Morrison, The Bluest Eye, for sexual abuse.
Are there any Lerone Bennett's on that list?
Let's see. This is a list from the American Library Association. So these are a little bit different age groups from that standpoint, but I just was surprised to see Of Mice and Men, Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah. Is that banned now?
It's been on the list. Kill a Mockingbird keeps coming up. And then there's a tremendous number of these books in the last 10 years that have homosexuality and LGBTQ connotations that have been part of the list. The Bluest Eye keeps showing up. Now, I can understand 50 Shades of Grey might be something you want to be careful about having in your library in the elementary school level, but it's just Kite Runner, Gossip Girl series. It's just interesting. To Kill a Mockingbird shows up almost every year over the past 15 years.
Of course it does.
The Color Purple.
Yeah. Well, again, it's not just the subject, it's how effective it is in challenging a worldview.
Right.
Right. Now, they may say, we don't need this in elementary school because of the language that's in there.
Mm-hmm.
Or because of the sexual scenes that are in there, or the gender challenges that are in there. I mean, and those could be legitimate arguments, right? But rather than ban, let's restrict it by age. Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Should Mein Kampf be banned?
I think Mein Kampf should be in the library.
Okay. But see, I bet you Mein Kampf isn't on that list.
No. Huckleberry Finn is.
See? And we know why.
Mm-hmm. So I think people should be able to make their own decisions.
That's being American.
Yeah. Well, then this goes back to the original conversation that started with freedom of speech and double standards at the social media level. And we really have returned back to the grassroots, which is education.
Yep.
And
we need to see it all as a threat, as a uniform threat to free speech. And you pointed this out in our conversation. There are different expressions of that threat in the private and governmental segments of our society. but the threat is still there.
Well, and what's always interesting for us, speaking at the level that we do, there is a very large portion of the American population that really doesn't even have a clue what's going on to them, and they just go with the flow. I mean, they're not aware that there are books not in their library
Right.
that they have no access to.
Yeah, because they and that they've never read.
Right. And
Right.
because somebody defined which books that they would be reading in elementary school.
So these people have actually used a solution that they are accusing others of causing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They don't, they're afraid of the influence of To Kill a Mockingbird.
Mm-hmm.
So they remove the influence, thereby influencing society themselves. It's just like any researcher. An observer of an experiment affects the experiment.
Yeah. Well, yes. And the interesting thing is, if you think about it, with the technology that we have now, if young adult is raised in a bubble, it's almost impossible not to have access to information. And if they go on a listserv, if they go into a community and somebody's talking about The Color Purple, and that's a book that just didn't cross their paths in high school, they're going to go find a copy of it somewhere and read it, because they'll become intrigued by something that they were prevented from having access to.
But there are two problems with that. First of all, these people don't care about that. They
Right.
don't care. They don't care if you have the initiative to go get it on your own.
Right.
They just don't want to spend public dollars to do it. That's their argument. Their argument is my dollars, but then my question is, well, but what if I want to spend my dollars? Who gives you the right to decide that my dollars can't be spent on this book? And if the answer is I got elected to the legislature, then the real answer for me is that in the Constitution? Is that where you get to do that? Again, my real distaste here is legislators think they know better than educators. My real problem here is all of a sudden, as a result of the success of one totalitarian type figure, we don't care about competence anymore. I believe that some people would be okay in putting certain people in engineering jobs for a spacecraft who've never taken an engineering class, as long as they don't believe in critical race theory, or as long as they're loyal to a particular person, then that person qualifies to be in this position. This is where we've gotten dangerous.
Well, and again, it goes back to the premise behind why we've had these conversations, which is to have a conversation and not restrict a conversation.
Yes.
And have it in a civil fashion.
Yes.
And agree to disagree.
And agree to disagree.
And to understand that there's more than one story out there. And because it's somebody else's story doesn't mean it's wrong. It's somebody else's story. Your story is your story. And we shouldn't be banning your story and letting you share your story. And I'm using this metaphorically, not Dr.
No, I hear you.
And I think that's what we're trying to do is ban people from telling their story. And we, as going back to Neanderthals, it's all about the story and sharing the story and passing the story down from generation to generation. We are really trying to edit not just past history, but future history by not letting us tell a story.
Well, I guess we're at the epilogue of this story.
Which is probably the prologue for another story.
Yeah. We want to thank Nationwide for supporting us again. And we also want to thank you, the listener, for once again spending some time with Peter and I.
Thank you so much, Phil, for sharing your story, and I'm sharing my story. And now I've got all of these books that have been banned that I want to go read.
just because they were banned?
Just because they were banned, and I've probably read of half of them, but I haven't even heard of half of them. But some of them are downstairs in the kids library from high school.
You do realize that means you've been raising heretics, right?
Good. The more heretical they are, the happier I am, because I don't want followers. I want leaders. I want disruptors. I want people just like me. So
I want intellectuals.
well, that we both have. There is no question about that.
Yeah.
So we will continue these conversations. Thank you for being a part of it. Don't forget to visit our website at www.peterandphil.com. Sign up to get this on a weekly basis and join us in our conversation. Share with us some thoughts that you may have about topics or things that we're saying that irritate you, because we would love to have some people who want to share both sides of the story, and we hope to have some of those in the coming months. So be well. We will talk to you again soon. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Peter. Talk to you later.
And we will talk again.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.